कुंज बिहारी गोपी जन वल्लभ गिरिवरधारी यशोदानंदन ब्रज जन रंजन यशोदानंदन ब्रज जन रंजन यमुना तीर वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी गोपी जन वल्लभ गिरिवरधारी गोपी जन वल्लभ गिरिवरधारी यशोदानंदन ब्रज जन रंजना यशोदानंदन ब्रज जन रंजना यशोदानंदन ब्रज जन रंजना यमुना तीर वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय विष्णुपाद परमहंस परिविचार्य स्तोत्र श्रीमद डिवाइन ग्रेस ऐसे भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी श्रील प्रभुपाद की ISKCON फाउंडर आचार्य बीबीटी फाउंडर श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस परिविचार्य स्तोत्र श्रीमद डिवाइन ग्रेस भक्ति सिद्धांत संस्था कुशल प्रभुपाद की अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की नामाचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद की श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की वृंदावन धाम की मायापुर नवदीप धाम की जगन्नाथपुरी धाम की गंगा माई की यमुना माई की भक्ति देवी की तुलसी महारानी की संवेद गौर भक्त वृंद की All glories to assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Shri Guru and Go. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam namaskritya naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam mudirayet. Hare Krishna. This morning we are reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 12, entitled Vritrasu's Glorious Death, text number 11. Purusha prakrutir vyaktam Atma bhutendriyashayah Shaknuvantyasya sargado Na vinayad anugrahat Purusha prakrutir vyaktam Atma bhutendriyashayah Shaknuvantyasya sargado Na vinayad anugrahat Purusha prakrutir vyaktam Atma bhutendriyashayah Shaknuvantyasya sargado Na vinayad anugrahat Matajis. Matajis. Word to word meaning. Purushaha, the generator of the total material energy. Prakruti, the material energy or material nature. Vyaktam, the principles of manifestation. Mahatattva. Atma, the false ego. Bhuta, the five material elements. Indriya, the 10 senses. Ashaya, the mind, intelligence and consciousness. Shaknuvanti, are able. Asya, of this universe. Sargado, in the creation, etc. Na, not. Vina, without. Yat, of whom. Anugrahat, the mercy. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. The three Purushas, Karanodakshaya Vishnu, Garbhodakshaya Vishnu and Shirodakshaya Vishnu, the material nature, the total material energy, the false ego, the five material elements, the material senses, the mind, the intelligence and consciousness cannot create the material manifestation without the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Purport. As confirmed in the Vishnu Puran, Parasya Brahmana Shaktis Tatedam Akhilam Jagat. Whatever manifestations we experience are nothing but various energies of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. These energies cannot create anything independently. This is also confirmed by the Lord Himself in Bhagavad Gita 9.10. Mayadhyakshena prakriti suyate sa characharam. This material nature is working under my direction, O son of Kunti, and it is producing all moving and unmoving living beings. Only under the direction of the Lord, the Supreme Person, can Prakriti, which is manifested in 24 elements, create different situations for the living entity. In the Vedas, the Lord says, Madiyam Mahimanam cha Parabrahmeti Shabditam Vetsyasya Anugrihitam me Samprashner Vivritam Ridhi. Since everything is a manifestation of my energy, I am known as Parabrahman. Therefore, everyone should hear from me about my glorious activities. The Lord also says in Bhagavad Gita, 10 chapter verse 2, Aham Adirhi Devanam. I am the origin of all the demigods. Therefore, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the origin of everything, and no one is independent of him. Srila Madhvacharya also says, Anisha Jiva Rupena. The living entity is Anisha, never the controller, but is always controlled. Therefore, when a living entity becomes proud of being an independent Ishvara or God, that is his foolishness. Such foolishness is described in the following verse. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namane Gauratvashe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shrivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna. Seeking the blessings of His Souless Bhakti Bhagavad Swami Maharaj and all the assembled Vaishnavas so that we can discuss on this important verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So in this beautiful section of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we find Vritrasur is encouraging Indra and is offering his prayers in glorification of the Supreme Lord. And in the series of verses, we find Vritrasur especially talking about how everyone in this material world is dependent, and the only personality who is independent is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna. That is the theme which Even Sonar Gaurang Prabhu was speaking in the last class. And the same theme is also continuing in this verse. And here in this verse it is mentioned that how Purusha, Prakriti, Vyaktam, Atma, Bhuta, Indriya, Ashaya. So all these various material elements, material energy, mind, intelligence, false ego, which are all, and the three Purusha avatars, who are all responsible for the creation of the material ingredients and the material universes. So all of them cannot function na vina yad anugrahat. Without the anugraha, without the mercy of the Supreme Lord, nobody can function. Everyone ultimately is dependent on the mercy of the Supreme Lord. No one can claim true independence. Though we may claim to be an independent nation, and so many other nations also claim themselves to be independent, yet, in the true sense, nobody is actually independent. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, therefore, when a living entity becomes proud of being an independent Ishvara or God, that is his foolishness, because no one is actually independent. In 1976, Srila Prabhupada was in Washington, D.C. in July. And sometime in July, I forget the exact date, there is the American Independence Day. 14th? 4th of July. So Srila Prabhupada was over there, and so some disciples, they invited Srila Prabhupada to attend a grand celebration, Independence Day celebrations in Washington, D.C., the highlight of which would be some grand fireworks. So, okay, Srila Prabhupada agreed, and Srila Prabhupada went along with some of the disciples for this celebration. And they were waiting for this, what everyone was very anxiously looking forward to, the grand fireworks. But as most events usually don't start on time, not only in India. So the fireworks that were supposed to commence at a particular time didn't commence. Thousands and thousands of people had gathered to watch this fireworks. And Srila Prabhupada and his disciples were waiting. Didn't start on time. Srila Prabhupada said, it's all right, we'll go back. So Srila Prabhupada came back to the temple. But next day, next day when Srila Prabhupada gave his Srimad Bhagavatam class, Srila Prabhupada spoke on this topic of real independence. And Srila Prabhupada began by saying, in this world, everyone is trying to become independent. But what independence does anyone have in this material world? So-called independence of the living entities in the material world is simply dog's independence. Why? Because just like a dog who may claim to have his territory and he thinks himself independent within that territory, and so he thinks, I'm the independent master, the controller of this territory, nobody else should come in. And as soon as somebody else comes in, immediately barks, bow, bow. So, but what is his independence? Somebody will take a stone and throw at the dog has to run away. So what is his independence? And then Srila Prabhupada gave another example. He said the independence is just like a criminal who is punished by dunking under water. So when the criminal is dunked under water, he's gasping for breath, He's thinking, all my independence has been taken away, seized away. But then for a few seconds, he's brought up and he thinks, wow, now I'm independent. But how long? A few seconds. And immediately after that, down again. So what independence is that? So as Prabhupada is saying over here, it's simply foolishness that one claims to be the independent proprietor, controller within this material nature, because actually no one is independent. As the third chapter, 27th verse of the Bhagavad Gita says, Prakrute kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashah ahankara vimudatma kartaham iti manyate. So ultimately everyone is being totally controlled by the three modes of material nature, but it's only somebody who's a vimudhatma, somebody who's foolish, who thinks that he has independence, and he thinks that I can adjust, I can change so many things of this world for my convenience. I can change heat into cold, cold into heat. I can do so many things. I can fight against diseases. So I'm independent. Who says I don't have independence? But this is simply utter foolishness, as Srila Prabhupada says. Because Prakriti, the material nature, is so powerful, being the external energy of the Supreme Lord Himself. And we are so insignificant jivas trying to combat with this powerful material energy. But all such attempts are simply foolish attempts, just like an insignificant frog trying to combat with a huge elephant. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur told this story of how once a frog got a 1 rupee coin, and he thought with his limited brain, he thought that having received this 1 rupee coin, I am the richest person in the entire creation. And so he thought. And so he became so puffed up with his acquired opulences that when he saw an elephant walking on the road from the opposite direction, he challenged the elephant and he said, "How dare you come on my path? Get off my path, otherwise I'll finish you." Simply an arrogant, worthless claim. What did the elephant care for this insignificant frog? The elephant kept majestically walking, and the frog raised his volume of his voice, challenging the elephant, telling him to get off his path. But the elephant kept marching forward and forward, and the frog soon realized that he was utterly helpless. Somehow, by destiny, the frog just missed one of the huge legs of the elephant. And the frog thought, "Wow, I have been saved today." But as the elephant walked ahead, from behind the elephant came a huge quantity of the elephant's response to material nature. And the richest personality in the universe very soon became submerged in this pool of the elephant's waste. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur tells this story to make this point that similarly, the Jivatma's attempts to fight, to combat, to adjust material nature will certainly, without a doubt, be foiled. And the insignificant living entity will simply have to unwillingly have to submit to the laws of material nature. Just like in the previous verse also, he says that just like a doll, a wooden doll, or an animal made of grass and leaves is totally independent, has no independence. Similarly, every jiva has absolutely no independence and is totally dependent. Even the greatest of personalities, Brahma, Shiva, the three Purusha avatars, Vishnus, everyone totally dependent on the mercy of the Supreme Lord. And what to speak of insignificant jivas like us. But it's only out of sheer foolishness, it's out of ignorance when one does not understand one's constitutional position. Then it's the asuric mentality due to which one thinks, Ishwaroham, Aham Bhogi. One thinks, I'm the controller, I'm the proprietor, I'm the enjoyer. So, but ultimately, everyone has to be subjected to the influence of material nature, which ultimately is under the control of the Supreme Lord. So some philosophers may accept material nature and how material nature is controlling everything, but then they fail to understand Mayadhyakshena Prakriti Suvete Sarcharachara, that above material nature there is a Supreme Lord who is totally controlling material nature. Srila Prabhupada, he talks about this Aja Galastana Nyai. So the logic of nipples on the neck of the goat. So just like one may assume that the nipples on the neck of a goat, the flesh that looks like nipples, from that one can get milk, but obviously one cannot. So similarly, one can assume that material nature is giving us everything, but then one fails to understand that material nature is totally dependent on the Supreme Lord. Srila Prabhupada in his lecture, he gives the example. He says that just like there is the huge aeroplane, which is definitely a wonderful machine, and the pilot just presses a few buttons and such a huge machine is wonderfully floating in space. But then, without the presence of the pilot, or if the pilot makes even a small mistake in pressing those buttons, this huge airplane will crash. Then how can one think that this entire cosmic machine is working independently? So, one has to understand that one is totally dependent. One has practically no independence. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada beautifully defines what is real independence in the first canto, 18th chapter, verse number 22, purport. Srila Prabhupada writes, real independence means complete faith in the mercy of the Lord without dependence on the conditions of matter. I repeat, real independence means complete faith in the mercy of the Lord without dependence on the conditions of matter. That is real independence. one has full faith that I'm simply dependent on the mercy of the Lord, and I'm not dependent on the conditions of matter, on the conditions of material nature, which are ever changing and which can actually offer no real protection and no real support to the living entities. As in the second canto of the Bhagavatam, Shukdev Goswami says, Deha apatya kalatradeshu atma saineshu asatswapi tesham pramatta nidhanam pashyanapi na pashyati. So, in situations of distress, calamities, one takes shelter of so many people, so many things. One's family members, relatives, wife, children, doctors, lawyers. These days, computers, Google. These days they're coming up with artificial intelligence. So many things people take shelter of. But one fails to understand that all these shelters are simply fallible shelters. None of these people can even protect themselves. What to speak of giving protection to somebody else? And so therefore, as long as one takes shelter of these fallible shelters, of any conditions of material nature or material things, they are bound to collapse. They're bound to be destroyed. Then how can they offer any shelter or protection to anybody else? So therefore, as long as one takes shelter of these other things, which are themselves controlled, one simply becomes bound in the material world. But when one takes shelter of the Supreme Lord, who is 100% Swarat, who is not dependent on anyone else, anything else, then by connecting to that supreme, independent, Supreme Lord, one can actually experience real independence. Narad Muni, because he takes full shelter of the Supreme Lord, therefore he has independence as much as, almost as much as that of the Supreme Lord. Because he has taken full shelter of the fully independent Supreme Personality of Godheads. And real renunciation is to accept and take shelter of that fully independent Supreme Lord. In that same purport, Srila Prabhupada again gives a beautiful definition and understanding of what is real renunciation. Srila Prabhupada writes, real renunciation means perfect dependence on God. Real renunciation means perfect dependence on God. And further on, in that same purport, Srila Prabhupada elaborates this point a little more, and he says, renunciation means renouncing one's dependence on the conditions of material nature and becoming completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. Renunciation means renouncing one's dependence on the conditions of material nature and becoming completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. That is sannyas. Sat nyas. Renouncing everything for Sat, for the Supreme. That is sannyas. And that is what Srila Prabhupada has taught us by taking sannyas. Srila Prabhupada, through his own life, through his teachings, has showed us what is the meaning of real renunciation and real sannyas. in the life of Srila Prabhupada himself, before he took sannyas, we can see that so many odds against him, so many situations of the material world were against him. His family members were against him. His wife chose tea instead of Srila Prabhupada. Of course, as one devotee said, that is our great fortune, that she chose tea. Because then Srila Prabhupada could renounce. That served as an impetus for renunciation. His business collapsed. His god brothers didn't support. So many situations. But still, Srila Prabhupada was not dependent on those situations of material nature, but he was fully dependent. He had full faith on the mercy of the Lord and his spiritual master. On many occasions, and on one occasion before Srila Prabhupada took sannyas, his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, came to him in a dream and urged him, pushed him to take sannyas. As Srila Prabhupada himself states in his lectures, how his spiritual master pushed him to take sannyas. And he woke up from that dream, and in Srila Prabhupada's words, he thought, how horrible. How can I leave everything of this world and take sannyas? But then he understood that that was the desire of his spiritual master. And that was one of the ways by which he could fulfill the instruction which he received in 1922. And that is to take the message of Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the English language to the Western world. And one of the ways by which he could fulfill that instruction was to take sannyas. And therefore Srila Prabhupada understood that in order to effectively preach, he should take sannyas. Srila Prabhupada wrote to the leader of the Chaitanya Mutt at that time, requesting him to arrange for his sannyas. But the leader at that time, he told Srila Prabhupada, first you must join the mutt, and of course we'll give you all facilities, but you stay here, do some services, and then we can arrange for your sannyas. But Srila Prabhupada, he knew that this was an emergency, this was an urgency, because the people of the world were rotting in ignorance and suffering. And so Srila Prabhupada, he could not wait. And then later on, he requested his godbrother, His Honor's Bhakti Pragya Keshav Maharaj at Mathura to offer him sannyas. And Keshav Maharaj was so supportive. In fact, Keshav Maharaj said, yes, you must immediately take sannyas. And seeing the enthusiasm of his godbrother, in fact, Srila Prabhupada, he little bit resisted, not immediately. But then Keshav Maharaj, he really pushed him. And Srila Prabhupada says, actually, my Guru Maharaj was pushing through my godbrother. Srila Prabhupada could clearly see that his godbrother was acting simply as an instrument of his Guru Maharaj's mission. And so therefore, Srila Prabhupada agreed, and on this auspicious day, which in that year was 17th of September 1959. So that was the auspicious day. In the morning, There was no advertisement, there were no invitations sent out. In the small Keshavji Gaudiya Mutt at Mathura, basically there were a few residents of the mutt who assembled for this ceremony. Srila Prabhupada that time, Abhay Babu, he was in white, but that was the last time anybody would see him in white. He was sitting on a kusha grass mat along with another candidate for sannyas, Sanatan Prabhu, who was 90 years old. And so these were the two candidates for sannyas on that day. His Holiness Bhakti Pragya Keshav Maharaj was seated on the asan. Keshav Maharaj's disciple, Narayan Maharaj, was conducting the ceremony, chanting the mantras and the other rituals. After Narayan Maharaj chanted the mantras, His Holiness Keshav Maharaj gave a lecture, and then something which was totally unprecedented and unexpected. Keshav Maharaj requested Abhay to speak. Nobody expected, even Srila Prabhupada didn't expect. But he was requested to speak. And so, before speaking, he looked at the audience. Being Mathura, the right language to speak in would be Hindi. But Srila Prabhupada, taking into consideration the purpose, the instruction for which he was taking sannyas, spoke in English, though very few people there, Keshav Maharaj and a few others, only they knew English, but still Srila Prabhupada was envisioning the future. And therefore, he spoke in English beautifully. After that, they were awarded the sannyas danda, the sannyas garments, which is a saffron cloth for a dhoti, an upper garment, and 2 pieces of cloth for a kaupin. And then His Holiness Keshav Maharaj gave Abhay his sannyas name, and that is Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj. Srila Prabhupada ki! His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki! And Srila Prabhupada, he took sannyas not simply for making a living, not for living a comfortable life, as many sannyasis at that time in Mathura and around in those areas were doing. But Srila Prabhupada accepted sannyas only for one purpose, and that is to fulfill the instruction of his spiritual master. And Srila Prabhupada, after taking sannyas, never relaxed. But immediately, Srila Prabhupada, with a few devotees, went traveling, preaching. And he went traveling to Jhansi, Kanpur, Agra. So those few places of North India he traveled. And then he came back to Vrindavan at the Vamsi Gopal temple. And immediately after that, Srila Prabhupada, in order to begin this preaching work, he thought that he must begin the translation of Srimad Bhagavatam. At that time also he received an invitation from the Goswami and the Radha Damodar temple to come and reside over there. And so Srila Prabhupada thought that it was very auspicious. And that's how then Srila Prabhupada shifted to the Radha Damodar temple. And then on the instruction of his Guru Maharaj again, who told him, whenever you get money, print books. To fulfill that instruction, he then began the translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam again. He was not dependent on the conditions of material nature. He was not dependent on the facilities that he had at that time. All what he had to print his Srimad Bhagavatam was a broken old typewriter. That's all. Living in such simple conditions with practically no money. So Srila Prabhupada, through his own life, he showed what is real renunciation. Not depending on the conditions of material nature, but fully depending, having full faith on the mercy of the Supreme Lord. And right from that time, Srila Prabhupada showed that. How he was not dependent on the facilities available, but he was fully dependent on the mercy of the Supreme Lord. And then later on we see that even after his translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam, after he decided to go to the West, then again, no facilities. Ticket on a cargo ship. Health problems. So many difficulties. Didn't know where he would stay. What would be the situation? Nothing. But he had full faith. He had full faith on the mercy of the Supreme Lord, full faith in the instruction of the spiritual master, and full faith in the holy name of the Lord. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. It was with that faith he embarked on this mission of starting an international society for Krishna consciousness. And that, as Srila Prabhupada writes in this purport, is real renunciation. Quite interestingly, these three festivals that come in a row are all definitely transcendentally dependent. First, we had the appearance day of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who envisioned this international society, who at that time in 1896 itself sent the life and precepts of Lord Chaitanya, this book, to the McGill University in Canada. And he declared, he predicted that very soon the day will come when people from all over the world, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, everyone will gather together with the Indian brothers and chant Jai Sachinandan Gaur Hari. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself predicted. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur predicted then how the glories of the holy name would be chanted, would be spread throughout the entire world. And then we celebrated the disappearance of the personality who was the root, the origin of the chanting of the holy names, who distributed the chanting of the holy names throughout the world. And that is the disappearance day of Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki. And then today we are celebrating the sannyas ceremony of His Divine Grace His Bhaktivedanta Srila Prabhupada, who did exactly the same work of Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur to take the chanting of the holy names throughout the entire world. And so therefore, we find that how Srila Prabhupada so perfectly followed the instructions and the footsteps of the previous acharyas in simply executing their mission. And Srila Prabhupada took sannyas in the month of Bhadra. And so that also is so wonderfully related to the glories of distributing Srimad Bhagavatam. And so now, since the last few years, thanks to His Grace Vaisheshika Prabhu and so many other senior devotees of ISKCON, the glories of distributing Srimad Bhagavatam on Bhadra Purnima have been well proclaimed, and everyone is aware of the glories, which is coming from the 12th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, 13th chapter, 13th verse, which says, Praushtapadyam Paurnamasyam Hemasimha Samanvitam Dadati Yo Bhagavatam Sayati Paramam Gatim. So here it is said that on the Bhadra Purnima, if one Hema Simha Samanvitam, Hema, golden throne. So here we have a golden throne for the Srimad Bhagavatam. At least it looks golden. So, Dadati, if somebody gives this, your Bhagavatam, somebody gives this Bhagavatam as a gift to someone on this auspicious day of Bhadra Purnima, the result will be Sayati Paramam Gatim. One will achieve the supreme transcendental abode of the Lord. So quite interestingly, Srila Prabhupada also took sannyas on this in the month of Bhadra, and of course this year it's falling exactly on the Bhadra Purnima day. So showing that how Srila Prabhupada took sannyas essentially for this purpose, and that is to distribute the glories of the Srimad Bhagavatam to the entire world, and that is what Srila Prabhupada did. Srila Prabhupada, one of his great treasures which he took with him to the West was the Srimad Bhagavatam, a trunk of the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam in 3 volumes, which was boarded the ship at Cochin. And that is what Srila Prabhupada took essentially. He didn't have anything else, but that is what he essentially took. The Srimad Bhagavatam, the faith in the Srimad Bhagavatam, faith in the Supreme Lord, faith in the Holy Name. That was the greatest treasure which Srila Prabhupada had. And that is how Srila Prabhupada showed what is real renunciation. As Srila Prabhupada himself writes in this purport, renunciation means renouncing one's dependence on the conditions of material nature and becoming completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. Thank you very much. Maharaj, would you like to comment or add some? Okay, fine. Does someone have any comments or questions? Thank you very much. ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय, श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय, संवेद गौर भक्त वृंद की जय। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। थैंक यू।